Hello and welcome to the Extremist Publishing Podcast. I'm Tom Christie, and it's a great pleasure to be joined today by the authors of a brand new book of history which will be of interest not only to followers of the past and culture of central Scotland, but of the country as a whole. The authors are Dr. Murray Cook, the local borough archaeologist here in Stirling, and also Mr. Jim Roche, who is a cultural historian and follower of military history. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming along today to discuss your brand new book, Conflicts of the Forth.
Hi Tom, thank you very much for that, and thank you to the Argylls for hosting us in Stirling Castle in their wonderful museum.
We are in the affiliation room, the affiliate room, which makes the connections that the regiment has around the world, from the Indian subcontinent to regiments in Canada and Australia.
I mean, there really can be no more fitting place to discuss our forthcoming book. Jim and I are of the opinion that Stirling is probably the most important place in Scottish history because of its geography, because its geography creates a pinch point, which means if you move north, you have to do it at Stirling, and if you wish to stop anyone moving north, you do it at Stirling. We think that Stirling is probably the bloodiest spot in the whole of Britain, certainly Scotland.
If you move, anyway you try to move an army north or south, you have to cross at or near Stirling Bridge, and we're surrounded with battle sites here. This is where the Romans crossed. There are Viking sites here. This is the site of Stirling Bridge battle, Bannockburn, the Battle of Sheriffmuir, and our book looks at all of this, starting even with Neolithic materials. Murray, tell us about that.
Well, yes. So the book, as Jim says, goes from the Neolithic, where the opening is the war on trees, where we're looking at the production of Neolithic polished stone axes and actually how these are used to clear trees. It goes through the Bronze Age weaponry, it goes through Iron Age hill forts, the Roman invasion, the Pictish invasion, the Viking invasion, the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the invasions from Argyll, all the way through the Wars of Independence, Cromwell, Bonnie Prince Charlie, through World War I, World War II, all the way through to the Cold War, and dealing with the threat of a Soviet nuclear holocaust aimed at Glasgow.
Well, that's one of the things that interested me about the book, and as your subtitle actually points out, it is a book that covers centuries, indeed millennia, of conflict here in the central Scotland area. What kind of challenges did that present to you both when it came to research and the actual writing of the book?
Well, I suspect the biggest one is the tone. We're dealing with conflict. We're dealing with conflict at a period when conflict is savaging the world. So this has to be done in a respectful manner. We have to explore where things happen. We have to celebrate heroism, but we have to be clear-eyed about confronting folly and how much of that folly is ours in our kind of global footprint in the second half of the first millennium, or the second half of the second millennium AD. I'm getting confused with my dates, such as the period, but we have to look at the footprint of the British Empire. Heroes, villains, folly, greed, celebration, all of those things, a very difficult tone to get right.
And we tend in our own time to look at topics like slavery and imagine that it's something that happened in the 17th and 18th centuries and the transatlantic slave trade. But we have to remember that it's been almost a part of human society since conflict began, because if you don't kill your enemies, all of them, then you're left with prisoners, and what do? You make them into slaves. And so when the Romans came to Scotland, they weren't sightseeing, they were looking out for slaves, for treasure. When the Vikings came, they were taking slaves from the local population as well. So it's a wide-ranging book reflecting on man's inhumanity to man, but also celebrating the bravery of people who fought and died for causes they believed in, and indeed for our freedom around the world.
There is an interesting point about slavery that Jim makes, and obviously we have David the First campaign in Northumbria, which used slavery as a weapon. we have the Wars of Independence in Scotland. And one of the interesting things about that is there is a form of slavery. Academics struggle with the term, but we talk about serfdom or the unfree. And these individuals existed prior to the Wars of Independence, but after them, the institution is gone. And one of the strands in the thinking is that everybody in Scotland fights for freedom, so that everybody must be free, including those that were unfree. And we can look at World War I, World War II, where the whole of society engages in that fight for freedom, that fight against tyranny, against evil, and actually society fundamentally changes as a consequence of the sacrifice that we all made, and a sacrifice that people are making again across the globe. Ukraine is on our minds at the moment, obviously.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because one of the really fascinating things that your book discusses is not just the nature of those conflicts in this area, but also the way in which they came to shape the country, its cultural history and its heritage. Would you like to say a little bit more about just how significant these things are?
Well, if you look at place names, we can learn a lot about our history, even from street names. In Stirling we have a Friar Street that led down to the Dominican Friary. We've got Pictish town names, we've got Gaelic town names, we've got town names that come from the Old Welsh Brittonic language that was spoken in the area. And so you can, even in looking at maps and walking around, you can see 1,000, maybe 1,500 years of history just in place names.
I mean, if we actually focus directly on the main place name, Stirling itself, which is likely is a corruption of the Gaelic for the pool on the Lynn, and probably relates to either the upper navigable point of the Forth or the lowest crossing point of the Forth, probably relating to Abbey Ford at Cambus Kenneth Abbey, which is undoubtedly the most important fording point in Scottish history, and the ability to control that, which for several hundred years lay on the frontier between Pickland and its successor polity Alapa and the Kingdom of Northumbria to the south. This of course means Edinburgh, Dunbar, Falkirk might well have been part of Northumbria. So this ford on the frontier becomes a focus for fortifications for Kenneth II. It becomes the focus for David I and his castle, or rather his borough at Stirling, the castle probably built by his older brother or his dad. And then ultimately Cambus Kenneth Abbey on the ford, presumably after the first Stirling Bridge is built. And that presumably relating to an act of penance on the part of David for the life that he's led. Of course, his mother, Margaret, is Scotland's only royal saint.
Well, it would be remiss not to mention one of the things that your book does cover in detail is the weaponry that was used in these conflicts. And it's a book which begins with arrowheads and makes its way all the way through to thermonuclear warheads and everything in between. What does the changing nature of that weaponry say about the nature of conflict here in this area?
I guess you start with pointy sticks, and pointy sticks develop into chipped stones that give point to a better point to a stick, and then arrows are invented and bows, and technology moves on. Animals are tamed so that we have small horses. In the time when the Romans arrive, chariots were being used with the local people. If you like, a chauffeur-driven military vehicle that was used by the upper classes in those times. And then we find all the way through to the war wolf, the trebuchet used against Stirling Castle, these huge wooden and metal structures hurling rocks.
I mean, it's worth noting. So the Loup de Guerre, the werewolf, the world's largest ever trebuchet, constructed on the orders of Edward I with material supplied by Robert the Bruce to drive out the last of the independent Scottish resistance to English rule results in the 1304 peace treaty that both Robert the Bruce and the Red Comyn sign. Of course, famously, the Red Comyn ends up getting killed by Robert the Bruce later on. That peace treaty, of course, one of the key elements of it is the capture of William Wallace, the greatest Scot. So all of these things, we used to think that warfare was one of the main motivations behind invention and human success, and indeed it is, but I think we overplay it. So in the 19th century thinking, some of which we explore in the book, we're dealing with racist kind of thought processes. So there are weaker peoples and superior peoples, and the clash of weaker civilizations against more stronger, virile civilizations. And this language we find astonishing, but we can find it in the interpretation, in the understanding of our past, and it's something else we have to confront. I think it's something the book tries to confront. How successful it is, you'll have to judge yourself upon reading, but inevitably those thoughts, those concepts led to Hitler and the Holocaust, so we rightly reject them.
We've been working on this book for years, Murray and I. We've talked about how we might construct something, and eventually we came to the thought that a short paragraph, 350 words or so, and a useful photograph per event would be the way ahead. But each location and any other relevant location is set out on very well produced maps, each one with a 10-figure grid reference. That takes us into 1 metre, doesn't it, Murray?
It does, and it's worth noting here that Jim is angling for a compliment for his son Patrick, who produced all the maps for a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of gin.
That's alcohol-free gin he wanted.
Well, now there is a crime. So the maps are good. Occasionally, with this story structure, so things are presented chronologically, but each has a number, so that sometimes there are clusters of locations that cover several hundred, if not 1,000 years. So you can read things chronologically, you can read it on the toilet, you can take it with you when you go for a wander. But the point being, we must understand our past in order to prevent making the same mistakes. And we have to be clear-eyed about exactly what happened and where it happened, so that we're not tricked by unscrupulous politicians reinventing or inventing some past slight that they use as a justification for actually drawing us into a conflict or insulting our allies or insulting our veterans. And obviously, we're recording this the week after the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and sometimes we have to think through this. We have to look at the veterans, frail men, heroes, and actually look at politicians standing next to them. And why is that important? Well, D-Day is the single biggest amphibious invasion in history. It is the beginning of the end of the Nazis, the single most evil force in world history. So does this mean that D-Day is the most important event in world history? If we can agree with that logic, then the Atlantic Wall replica at Sheriff Muir to the north of Stirling must be the most important archaeological site in Scotland. And we have to see that, we have to understand that. Look at the scale of achievement, the effort that was spent in preparing for D-Day in order to begin to understand the scale of D-Day. And the commemorative acts, while worthy, almost diminish what actually happened. The collective efforts of the free world to liberate occupied Europe, absolutely astonishing. And of course, D-Day is just the beginning. There is months of conflict as the Allies fight across Europe. Christmas 1944, Scots, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in occupied Europe, thinking about what they're going to do to confront Hitler, to confront his German allies, and actually get rid of them.
It's remarkable to think that In 1940, the huge French army collapsed. The British army managed to retreat at Dunkirk, and less than 4 years later, the British economy, the Empire, the Commonwealth, the United States had all arranged their military economy such that we were able to land soldiers in 1944, 150,000 men, I think, on the first day, 11,000 ships of various sizes, mostly manned by Royal Navy or Royal Canadian Navy. It's quite remarkable. And the location at Sheriffmuir is a replica, not just of the wall itself, the Atlantic Wall, but of all the defences, the gun positions, the Tobruk bunker, blockhouses that were used in rehearsals for that invasion, for the liberation of Western Europe.
But I think we also, we rightly kind of touch upon that, but of course there's everything else in the book. So Roman fording points, the Antonine Wall, the fort at Braco, perhaps the best preserved timber fort in the world. We go where the Roman army crossed, where Emperor Septimius Severus must have crossed with his wife, the Julia Domna.
In the biggest invasion of Scotland ever.
In the biggest, yes, indeed. If we believe Cassius Dio, 50,000 troops, somewhere around 210 AD, and a devastating impact on civilian settlement round southern Scotland that doesn't recover for 100 years, and then we end up with, when it does come back, it's the Picts. So we explore who the Picts are, how that name arrives, how we go from being a raiding society to one of the greatest early medieval kingdoms in Britain, more unified than anything in England at the time, certainly more unified than Ireland or Wales. And we visit Pictish settlement sites, Pictish fortifications, structures that may have been destroyed by the Romans, structures that may have been destroyed by the raiding Viking army, and how that wave of Viking invasions towards the end of the 9th century destabilises the whole of Pictland, such that it actually has to rebrand itself as Alapa, an incredible event that we still don't understand.
Now, one thing that's sure to fascinate readers is the fact that your book does cover really huge figures from history. We've mentioned Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, and also one-time Member of Parliament for Dundee, a certain Winston Churchill. But the book also covers so many different characters, truly amazing and significant people who might not have been so well heard of. What kind of research went into that, to uncover some of these heroes from times past?
Well, a lot of it begins with walks. One of the interesting things about the Old Town Cemetery in Stirling is just who's buried there. So General Ewart, who features so prominently in the Relief of Lucknow, Colonel Blackadder, who plays a prominent role in the Glorious Revolution in the 1715, the Battle of Sheriffmuir, or the predicted outcome. So once you find these names, a lot of them have biographies, autobiographies, biographies, but the detail is surprising. There is a General Samuel Graham, who is buried in the Church of the Holy Rood. He has a bronze plaque, and it talks about Washington's lottery of death. And actually, that's intriguing. So these little sparks that are not really explained let you drill into something. And of course, I have to now explain this to you. This is the American Wars of Independence, and Samuel Graham is a British junior officer. There is a tit-for-tat killing amongst the kind of patriots and the extrajudicial killings, and Washington orders that one of several British lieutenants captured, or lieutenants rather, are going to be executed as punishment for the death of an American patriot. And it's not Graham that's captured, it's Argyll. And this becomes known as the Argyll affair, and Washington is criticised in the American Congress. Marie Antoinette, the French Queen, criticises the whole affair. So, from a bronze plaque in a church in central Scotland to America to pre-revolutionary France. And we hope that the book does the same thing for you, that a small paragraph unveils and opens up a wider door for your own research.
There's a grave in the cemetery that marks the remains of a man who fought at the Battle of Waterloo, who was in the 2nd Battalion 95th Rifles, and there's a little reference on that to Montevideo, and when we looked into that, it was part of a rather botched attempt to invade Latin America in the early mid-19th century, before the Battle of Waterloo itself. And the 95th, the 2nd Battalion and the 95th were there when the Imperial Guard were finally thrown back off the ridge in June 1815. So lots of stories emerge just from those few words on a gravestone.
Well, Murray and Jim, thank you so much for having joined us today to discuss what has been a really interesting topic. Conflicts of the Forth is an amazing book, one which covers an enormous sweep of history, but is also fully illustrated with full colour illustrations, each one illustrating a very, very different part of Scotland's history, and indeed the history of conflict in the area. And if you want to find out just what an amazing range of illustrations those are, you'll just have to buy the book. So thank you so much for having joined us today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Buy the book.
Conflicts of the Forth is available to buy from all good online retailers and independent booksellers worldwide. Thanks very much for joining us today. I hope that you'll tune in again soon.